Yeah, think of this as your shortcut, maybe, to understanding how China's history and its dealings with other nations have shaped the global landscape we see today.
It's quite a story, really. And you kind of need that background to grasp where things might be going.
Absolutely. We've got a stack of interesting stuff to unpack from way back when right up to, well, today's headlines. It's all aimed at making China's role clearer for anyone curious about international relations, global politics, how it all connects economically.
And to do that, you really need to look at where it's come from, its long history.
Totally. So you should get a pretty well-rounded picture.
Which is important. The key is to cut through all the noise, isn't it? Find those connections, those shifts that really shine a light on what's happening.
Yeah, those aha moments that make it click.
Exactly.
Our aim here is to give you that understanding without, drowning you in details. We want to provide a clear structure, a framework, so you can grasp the essentials of China's global role. Maybe surprise you with a fact or two.
Sounds good. Let's get into it.
Okay, let's dive in. We're going deep on China, aiming for those light bulb moments.
Because when you look at China's journey, it really is pretty unique. It stands apart in world history.
Let's start way, way back, shall we?
Yeah.
We're talking about China as one of the oldest continuous civilizations, something like 4,000 years.
Yeah, it really makes you think, especially when you compare it to other ancient powers that, eventually disappeared. Mesopotamia, Egypt.
Right, that thread of Chinese civilization, it hasn't really been broken. There's a continuity there.
It's quite remarkable.
So the early empire, it really solidified under the first emperor around 221 BC. And that's when trade started picking up along the Silk Road.
And Chinese goods were incredibly valuable back then. Silk, obviously, but also tea, porcelain.
Hugely prized. And get this, they were super protective of their technology, like how to make silk. Kept it a closely guarded secret for centuries.
That control over production gave them huge economic leverage, didn't it? The Silk Road wasn't just about goods moving, it was about influence.
I read this great story about Byzantine monks who supposedly smuggled silkworm larvae out, hiding them in bamboo walking sticks.
Wow, really? Shows how desperate others were to break that monopoly.
Exactly. It underscores the value, not just monetary, but the sort of strategic importance of that technology.
And geographically, ancient China was pretty isolated too, wasn't it?
Yeah, you've got the Himalayas, the Gobi Desert, jungles.
That isolation definitely played a role in shaping its development. Fostered a sense of self-reliance, a unique culture, maybe different from Europe, which was always interacting, competing.
Good point. So by the 10th century AD, foreign trade had picked up more. But let's flash forward quite a bit to the 19th century. Things get really tense with Britain and the Opium Wars. What was really driving that conflict?
Well, at its core, it was about trade, specifically trade imbalances. Britain followed this idea called mercantilism.
Right, wanting to export more than you import to get wealthy.
Exactly. And they were buying lots of Chinese tea and silk, but China wasn't really buying much British stuff in return. The emperor famously wasn't impressed with British goods.
So Britain found something the Chinese would buy: opium, grown mostly in British India.
And it was incredibly addictive. They started pouring vast amounts of it into China. This led to a huge outflow of silver from China to pay for the opium.
And terrible social problems, right? Widespread addiction, corruption.
Absolutely devastating. It wasn't just a trade issue. It was, well, arguably a deliberate strategy that massively weakened the Qing dynasty. The impact was profound and long-lasting. You can still feel the echoes today.
The Chinese government tried to ban it, of course.
They did, but the smuggling just exploded. Britain used the ban and the seizure of opium as a pretext for war.
Which led to the First Opium War. China lost badly.
Yeah, they lost territory, Hong Kong, for instance, and were forced into unequal treaties. It basically ushered in what the Chinese call the Century of Humiliation, a period of being dominated by foreign powers.
It was a massive shock, exposing their vulnerability. And you often hear about Lin Zexu.
Yes, the official who tried to stamp out the opium trade. He's seen as a national hero in China for standing up to the British. He really embodies that resistance.
So after that, things didn't get much better internally for China, did they? The Qing dynasty continued its slow decline.
Right. Lots of internal instability, rebellions. It's interesting to contrast it with Japan during the same period. Japan faced similar pressures, but reacted very differently with the Meiji Restoration.
Modernizing rapidly, industrializing.
Exactly, whereas China struggled. Then in 1911, the Xinhai Revolution finally overthrew the emperor, end of the imperial era.
But that didn't exactly lead to stability.
No, not immediately. It led to a period of, well, political anarchy, with regional warlords carving up the country.
And out of this chaos, you see the rise of two major forces, the Communist Party and the Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang.
Right. The communists, led eventually by Mao Zedong, found their support base mainly among the rural peasants, promising land reform.
While the nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, were more aligned with industrialists, the urban elite.
Those different bases of support were crucial later on, but then another external threat emerged.
Japan, increasingly expansionist.
Yeah. Japan invaded Manchuria in the early 30s and then launched a full-scale invasion in 1937, starting the Second Sino-Japanese War.
Which forced the communists and nationalists into an uneasy alliance, didn't it?
It did. A united front against Japan, but they never really trusted each other. They had different strategies for fighting the Japanese, too.
And the war itself was incredibly brutal, devastating for China. It also significantly weakened the nationalist government and forces.
Definitely. They bore the brunt of the conventional fighting against Japan.
So after Japan is defeated in World War II in 1945,
The civil war between the communists and nationalists resumed almost immediately.
and this time the communists gained the upper hand.
Yeah. They had popular support in the countryside, effective guerrilla tactics, and the nationalists were plagued by corruption and mismanagement.
So in 1949, Mao Zedong declared the founding of the People's Republic of China in Beijing,
And Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists retreated to the island of Taiwan.
setting up a rival government there, which then received significant support from the United States.
Right, and mainland China initially aligned itself with the Soviet Union, so you had this division setting the stage for decades of tension in the region.
Okay, wow. That's a whirlwind tour through centuries. Quite the setup for understanding modern China. Now let's shift gears to the Mao era itself.
Right, from 1949 onwards, this was a period of radical transformation aiming to build a socialist state. How did that kick off?
Well, initially there was a period of socialist construction with quite a bit of help from the Soviet Union. Think nationalizing industries, collectivizing agriculture, setting up a planned economy.
Following the Soviet model, essentially.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
But then came the Great Leap Forward, starting in 1958. This was Mao's big push to rapidly industrialize and boost agricultural output really fast.
With a particular obsession on steel production.
Yeah, exactly. The ambition was huge, trying to catch up with Britain and the US in just a few years. They set up these large peasant communes where everything was collective.
And people were encouraged to build backyard furnaces to make steel.
Yeah, literally in their villages, melting down pots, pans, tools. The focus was entirely on quantity, not quality.
Right.
Most of the steel produced was useless.
And what happened to farming during this?
It was neglected. Peasants were diverted to steelmaking or massive irrigation projects, often poorly planned. Coupled with bad weather and unrealistic quotas, crops ended up rotting in the fields.
A recipe for disaster.
Absolutely. And then there was the Four Pests campaign.
Ah, yes. Targeting sparrows, rats, flies, and mosquitoes.
The idea was sparrows ate grain, so getting rid of them would increase harvests. But they forgot sparrows also eat insects, especially locusts.
So killing the sparrows led to...
Massive locust plagues. It completely backfired. They actually ended up having to import sparrows from the Soviet Union to try and restore the ecological balance. It's a kind of grimly absurd example of unintended consequences.
It really highlights the dangers of ignoring basic ecology and central planning.
Tragically, the combination of the Great Leap Forward policies and the environmental problems led to a horrific famine.
One of the worst in human history. The estimates vary, but we're talking somewhere between 20 and 45 million deaths. Just staggering.
It's almost impossible to comprehend. So despite the intense ideological fervor and the cult of Mao, actual economic progress during this period was pretty limited. China remained largely poor, agrarian.
A huge human cost for very little gain, economically speaking.
Yet it wasn't all negative, was it? There were some achievements under Mao.
That's true. Things like literacy rates improved significantly. Basic healthcare was expanded, reaching more of the population than ever before. Life expectancy did increase.
And it fostered a sense of national unity, perhaps, after decades of division and war. A feeling the government, however flawed, was trying to provide something.
Yes, and paradoxically, Mao's image and his Little Red Book gained a strange sort of popularity internationally in certain circles during the 60s.
So, A really complex legacy, immense suffering and economic failure, but also some social changes and a consolidation of national identity.
Okay.
After Mao's death in 1976, things began to change dramatically. Let's talk about Deng Xiaoping.
Right. Deng represents a major pivot. After the turmoil of the Cultural Revolution, which followed the Great Leap Forward, there was a sense within parts of the party that things had to change. Deng was a pragmatist.
Embodied by that famous saying, right? It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white.
As long as it catches mice, exactly. Results over ideology. That became the new mantra.
So the key moment was a Communist Party meeting, a plenum, in 1978.
Yes. That plenum effectively marked the end of the Maoist era's focus on class struggle and shifted the priority to economic development, modernization. Rational ideas were back on the table.
And we started seeing experiments, didn't we?
Yeah.
Like in Anhui province.
There's this famous story of peasants in one village secretly agreeing to divide the collective land and farm individually. They kept the state quotas, but kept the surplus for themselves.
And what happened?
Their output soared. It was technically illegal, but the results were undeniable. Eventually, this kind of household responsibility system was recognized and rolled out nationally.
A huge shift, returning to individual incentives in farming.
Absolutely crucial. It unleashed productivity in the countryside, but Deng's other major move was opening China up to the outside world.
Right. Actively seeking foreign investment, technology.
Yeah. Establishing special economic zones, or SEZs. Shenzhen, right next to Hong Kong, is the prime example. It went from a small fishing village
To a megacity.
Yeah.
I saw the figures GDP from maybe $40 million to over $400 billion in just 40 years.
It's incredible growth. These SEZs attracted massive foreign investment, companies eager to tap into China's low labor costs. China effectively became the world's factory.
A stunning transformation, fueled by foreign capital and Deng's reforms. But crucially, the political system didn't liberalize in the same way, did it?
Not at all. The Communist Party maintained its absolute grip on power. You still see Mao's portrait on the currency on Tiananmen Square.
And Deng himself laid out the four cardinal principles, right?
Yeah,
Things that couldn't be challenged, like the leadership of the party and the socialist road.
exactly. So you had this developing model of, well, market economics under strict authoritarian political control, a unique hybrid.
This rapid change wasn't without problems, though. There was inflation, partly due to things like the dual price system.
Right, where some goods had state prices and others market prices, creating distortions and opportunities for corruption.
And this growing discontent, alongside calls for political reform, culminated in the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989.
A major crisis, ending tragically with the military crackdown. It was a stark reminder of the limits of political freedom.
Deng Xiaoping had officially stepped back from top roles by then, but he was still pulling the strings. After Tiananmen, there was uncertainty about the future of reform.
But then Deng made his famous Southern tour in 1992. He visited the booming SEZs like Shenzhen, reaffirming the commitment to economic opening and reform.
Kind of putting his stamp on it, saying this is the path forward.
Exactly. It quelled the hardliners and gave reforms renewed momentum. It was a pivotal moment ensuring the economic transformation continued.
Okay, so that sets the stage for China's modern economic power. How did they then leverage this to build global influence? What was the strategy?
Well, it wasn't just one thing, it was multifaceted. One key aspect was how they engaged with foreign companies.
The joint venture requirement.
Right. For years, if foreign companies wanted access to the huge Chinese market, they often had to partner with a Chinese company. This inevitably led to technology transfer, whether intended or not.
So Chinese companies learned from their foreign partners. And they weren't afraid to, let's say, copy and adapt foreign tech either.
No, there are plenty of examples, from early cars based on Soviet designs to later accusations about products looking remarkably similar to Western ones, like the Chevrolet Spark and a Chinese counterpart. It was a way to rapidly build their own industrial capacity.
And alongside that, they invested massively in infrastructure within China.
Huge amounts. High-speed rail is the poster child. They initially bought trains from Japan, Germany, France.
Like the Sapsan, based on Siemens technology.
Right. But they very quickly learned, adapted, and developed their own world-leading high-speed rail technology and built the world's largest network by far. Same with skyscrapers. The pace of construction has been phenomenal.
That internal development then provided a foundation for projecting power outwards, right? Which brings us to the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI.
Exactly. This is China's massive global infrastructure project, funding and building roads, ports, railways, power plants across Asia, Africa, Europe, Latin America.
We're talking hundreds of billions, maybe trillions of dollars invested or pledged.
The scale is unprecedented. Officially, it's about connectivity, shared development, a win-win.
But there are criticisms, aren't there? Concerns about debt traps.
Yes. The idea that some countries borrow heavily from China for these projects, can't repay, and then China potentially gains control over strategic assets. The port in Sri Lanka is often cited.
Or situations like in Ecuador with a hydropower plant used as collateral.
Right. So while the BRI builds infrastructure, it also significantly expands China's economic leverage and, consequently, its political influence in these countries. We're seeing more Chinese workers and businesses operating globally, too.
And underlying this is still a very export-focused growth model, right? Often described as mercantilist.
Yeah, aiming to maximize exports, run trade surpluses, while sometimes limiting access to their own domestic market.
Like banning many Western internet platforms, Google, Facebook, Twitter, while Chinese tech giants thrive domestically and then expand overseas.
Precisely. And then there are the ongoing complaints about intellectual property theft.
A huge issue for many foreign companies.
And significant government subsidies for Chinese firms, helping them undercut competitors globally. Think about BYD and electric vehicles rapidly challenging Tesla and others.
Yeah, it's a big one right now. And they've also used currency devaluation in the past, haven't they? To make exports cheaper and offset things like tariffs.
Yes, managing the currency value has been another tool in their economic strategy. All these things combined have fueled their rise, but also created significant friction.
Which leads us neatly into the current global interactions and the challenges China faces now.
Because that friction is really apparent now. We're seeing pushback and a more complex geopolitical environment.
The trade tensions with the U.S. definitely ramped up under the Trump administration. Tariffs were imposed. What was the stated rationale?
The U.S. pointed to the large trade deficit, allegations of widespread intellectual property theft, forced technology transfer, and other practices they saw as unfair and violating WTO principles. They argued China hadn't played by the rules. Some also linked it to curbing funds that could fuel China's military expansion.
And China retaliated with its own tariffs, of course.
Yes, hitting U.S. agricultural exports particularly hard. The core U.S. argument was, and largely remains, that China practices a form of state-led mercantilism that disadvantages others.
And it's not just the U.S. raising concerns, is it?
No. We're seeing U.S. allies also becoming more wary. The EU, for example, has accused China of indirectly supporting Russia's war in Ukraine by supplying dual-use goods things with both civilian and military applications.
And they've raised concerns about North Korean workers potentially being used in China, violating sanctions. India also has its own long-standing border disputes and trade issues with China.
So there's a growing sense among some Western and regional powers of needing to counter what they perceive as China's bullying behavior or unfair practices.
Geopolitically, we're seeing a clear alignment, or at least closer ties, between China and Russia.
Yeah, driven by a shared interest in challenging the U.S.-led post-World War II international order. They see it as overly dominated by Washington. We also see closer ties, though complex ones, with Iran and North Korea.
And the U.S. response has been to try and strengthen its own alliances in Asia and Europe.
Exactly. Strengthening ties with Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines, and bolstering NATO to counter this perceived challenge from authoritarian states.
Another big issue that came into focus, especially during the pandemic, was the world's dependence on China for certain goods.
Critical goods, yeah. Pharmaceuticals, active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs, medical supplies. It really highlighted the potential vulnerabilities in global supply chains and the link between economic security and national security.
Definitely a wake-up call for many countries.
And related to economic security, there's the issue of financial transparency. There have been moves in the U.S. to potentially delist Chinese companies from stock exchanges if they don't allow U.S. regulators access to their audit papers.
Right, creating uncertainty for investors. And high-profile cases like the Evergrande debt crisis haven't helped confidence in the reliability of some Chinese corporate reporting.
Transparency and adhering to international financial norms remain points of friction.
Shifting to domestic challenges, demographics seem like a huge one looming for China.
Absolutely. Decades of the strict one-child policy, even though it's been relaxed, have left a lasting legacy. A rapidly aging population, a shrinking workforce, and a significant gender imbalance with more men than women.
What are the impacts of that?
Huge potential impacts. Fewer workers supporting more retirees puts immense strain on Social Security and healthcare. It could dampen domestic consumption and make it harder to sustain economic growth.
And rising labor costs in China are already a factor, aren't they?
Yes. China isn't the super low-cost manufacturing hub it once was. Some companies are looking elsewhere in Asia or nearshoring back closer to home. We've actually seen a net outflow of foreign direct investment recently.
That's significant. Then there are the territorial disputes, which always seem to simmer. Taiwan is obviously the most prominent.
And arguably the most dangerous flashpoint. You have Beijing's long-stated goal of reunification, framed partly by that desire to end the century of humiliation, clashing with a growing sense of a distinct Taiwanese identity and resistance to PRC control.
The U.S. commitment to help Taiwan defend itself adds another layer of complexity.
Hugely complex. And then there's Hong Kong, where Beijing imposed a sweeping national security law, effectively ending the one country, two systems framework promised after the handover from Britain.
Raising major concerns about autonomy and freedoms there.
Right. So pulling back, you really see this fundamental rivalry playing out between China and the U.S. It's often framed as authoritarian capitalism versus democratic capitalism.
Two different models competing for global influence, and despite being deeply intertwined economically.
There's a definite push towards decoupling or de-risking in strategic areas like advanced technology, critical minerals. Though complete decoupling seems unlikely given the scale of economic ties. Even seeing a Bank of China branch operating in the U.S. highlights that complex interdependence.
And internally, we can't ignore the methods of social control, the social credit system.
It's still mostly a patchwork of pilot programs, not a single unified national score yet. But the potential for widespread surveillance and control based on behavior is there. It involves tracking citizens, restricting travel for some,
Alongside tight control over information, the internet, religion, the treatment of the Uyghur Muslim minority in Xinjiang being a major point of international condemnation.
These issues raise fundamental questions about human rights and are a significant source of friction with many countries.
Finally, there's corruption. It's often said to be pervasive, despite severe penalties, even the death penalty in some cases.
Yes, it remains a persistent challenge. Xi Jinping has waged a high-profile anti-corruption campaign since coming to power.
Which has netted some very high-level officials, but critics also say it's been a convenient way for him to consolidate power and remove rivals.
That's often part of the analysis, yes. It's a complex issue with deep roots.
Okay, wow. We have covered an enormous amount of ground in this deep dive.
You really have, from ancient history right up to the complexities of today.
For me, some of the big takeaways are just the sheer speed and scale of China's transformation in recent decades. It's mind-boggling.
It truly is.
And also their very strategic long-term approach to acquiring technology, building infrastructure, expanding influence, and importantly, that it's not a simple black and white story. There are so many nuances and different perspectives on China's role.
Absolutely. Understanding that unique blend of state direction and market forces within an authoritarian framework is just crucial to making sense of it.
So, thinking about all this, what should listeners maybe be mulling over after hearing this?
We'll definitely consider the long-term implications of China's rise. How might it reshape the global order? What are the real potential flashpoints for conflict? But also, where could there be areas for cooperation on climate change, for instance?
And keep an eye on China's domestic situation, its economy, its politics, those demographic challenges, because they have huge international repercussions.
It really pushes us to think about what a more multipolar world with China as a central player actually looks like and how different countries will navigate that.
Right. So here's maybe a final thought to leave you with. Out of everything we've touched on, the history, the economy, the politics, the global impact, what's the one aspect of China's role that you find most compelling or perhaps most concerning, and why?
Mulling that over, thinking about what resonates most personally can be a good way to start digging deeper. And it's so important, I think, to approach studying China with an open mind, trying to understand its own perspectives and context, not just seeing it through our own lens.
Well said. A complex topic, hopefully made a little clearer.
Great.
Yeah, it's a complex one.
You've given us some fantastic material, and our goal today is to unpack this recent surge in U.S. tariffs on China. I mean, hitting a whopping 125%.
It's a staggering figure.
Especially when you contrast that with the tariff pauses for other countries, we want to figure out, what's really driving this aggressive move? What kind of ripple effects might it have?
And how the rest of the world is reacting. Plus, we need to dig into long history, the backstory that's brought us here.
Exactly. You're looking to understand the bigger picture without getting bogged down, and that's our sweet spot.
We've got a great mix of insights today. A really revealing interview that adds layers to the US-China dynamic. It's a complex story, and we're here to try and make sense of it together.
Okay, so let's get straight to it. These tariffs. The Business Basics video really jumps into this 125% figure. What's the sort of central argument for why the U.S. took such a drastic step, according to that analysis?
Well, what's fascinating here is the core justification presented. The video argues that Trump's primary aim is to put the brakes on China's military expansion.
Military spending. Interesting angle.
Yeah, the logic hinges on the significant trade imbalance between the two countries. This source emphasizes that China's exports to the U.S. are, remarkably, 5 times greater than what the U.S. sells to China.
5 times? That's huge.
It is. And the argument is that by squeezing this trade surplus through tariffs, the U.S. can directly impact the resources Beijing has for military development. It's all about leveraging that imbalance. Now, what's crucial to understand here, and maybe not fully explored in that specific clip, is that this imbalance isn't just about more goods flowing one way. It often reflects different economic structures, specialization.
Right, supply chains.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And simply fixing it with tariffs can have, well, unintended consequences for everyone involved.
Okay, but that 5 times figure, that really puts the U.S. in what looks like a position of strength, at least in this narrative. The video also breaks down how we actually got to 125%, starting with smaller tariffs.
Yeah, can you walk us through that escalation? Certainly. The video details a pretty rapid step-by-step ratcheting up. It began with 2 separate 10% tariffs earlier this year, specifically targeting fentanyl-related stuff.
Right, the precursor.
Acknowledging China's role there. Then, when broader reciprocal tariffs were announced by the U.S., China faced a 34% levy, which they matched immediately.
Tit for tat.
Precisely. In response, the U.S. issued a very quick ultimatum. Remove your tariffs, or we add another 50%. China didn't blink.
So then what?
So the total U.S. tariff on many Chinese goods jumped to 104%. Then, China retaliated again, another 50% hike on their side.
Wow, escalating fast.
Extremely fast. And that's when President Trump announced the comprehensive 125% tariff. The video clarifies this isn't cumulative, it's a new, all-encompassing rate for goods from China.
So wiping the slate clean at 125%. A clear pressure campaign.
Definitely deliberate. But the Business Basics video also mentions this temporary pause at a much lower rate for other countries. What was the strategy there?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger geopolitical picture, the 90-day pause, and that reduced 10% reciprocal tariff for countries that didn't retaliate.
Oh, okay.
That points to a calculated strategy to, well, isolate China.
Makes sense.
By offering a softer approach to allies and others who held back on tariffs, the U.S. aimed to single out China, portray them as the main disruptor.
Kind of like building a coalition by default.
Something like that, yeah. Differentiating between those seen as playing by the rules, quote unquote, those perceived as not.
Okay, isolate the target. Strategically, that fits. Now, shifting to the deeper issues, beyond just these immediate tariff fights, our sources highlight some long-standing complaints the U.S. has with China. What are the core grievances that come up?
Yeah, this gets into the fundamental tensions, doesn't it? Both sources we looked at underscore accusations of China's unfair trade practices. Things like IP theft, intellectual property theft.
That comes up a lot.
And what's described as a mercantilist approach.
Mercantilist, can you unpack that a bit?
Sure. Essentially, it's an economic strategy where a country tries to export as much as possible and import as little as possible to pile up wealth.
Right, hoarding gold back in the day.
Kind of.
Yeah.
In China's case, it's seen not just in limiting imports, but also, strategic government support for key domestic industries, aiming for global dominance.
And the blocked websites.
Exactly. Blocking major U.S. platforms like YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, that's a clear example of restricting market access while their companies enjoy relatively open access elsewhere.
And the joint venture requirement. Forced tech transfer.
That's another huge sticking point. Requiring foreign companies to partner with Chinese firms, often leading to technology transfer. It's seen as China getting IP without a fair exchange.
The Business Basics video uses Tesla as an example, right?
Right.
They go into China, then suddenly face competition from BYD.
Allegedly using stolen tech and getting government help. Yeah, that anecdote really highlights the frustration for U.S. businesses.
You invest, innovate, enter the market, and then compete against someone who seemingly got your tech, plus state backing.
It explains some of the anger. The commentator in Business Basics even suggests much higher tariffs, like 400%.
A staggering 400%, arguing China just hasn't played by WTO rules since it joined.
Wow, that really shows the strength of feeling there. Now, that analysis also points to a growing global alignment against China. What evidence does it give for that?
The evidence presented focuses on the EU and India, reportedly siding with the US because of what's called China's bullying behavior. The video highlights a statement from an EU commissioner worried about China enabling Russia's war in Ukraine by providing dual-use goods.
Dual use, meaning civilian and military applications.
Exactly. There's even a mention, quite controversially, of alleged North Korean troops and equipment facilitated by Russia and China.
That's a serious claim.
Very serious. And then there's this observation about the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, apparently seeming to avoid Chinese and Russian ships.
That is intriguing. What's the interpretation?
It's presented as potentially indicating some sort of alignment between those actors, running counter to Western interests.
Interesting undercurrents.
And the perspective from India's commerce minister, shared in the video, echoes those long-standing concerns China's unfair trade practices fueling its growth at others' expense.
So shared concerns, but maybe not a fully unified front.
That's a key nuance. Concerns are shared, yes, but motivations and willingness to act aggressively like the U.S., that varies a lot. It's complex.
Okay. The video also discussed the U.S. shifting focus, right? Tariffs on China, but hitting pause on allies. What was the strategic thinking there?
The schist, as presented, seems heavily geopolitical. By focusing tariff pressure on China and easing up, temporarily at least, on allies like Canada and Mexico, the U.S. aims to build a stronger, more unified front against China.
Makes sense. Isolate an ally.
The video suggests a deliberate effort to, quote, onshore high-end manufacturing back to the U.S., while maybe shifting lower-end stuff to friendly nations. Mexico is mentioned.
Building a more secure allied supply chain.
That seems to be the idea, countering this perceived alignment of China, Russia, Iran, North Korea.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing internally, right? There was pushback on the broader allied tariffs from people like Scott Bessent, Jamie Dimon.
Yeah, this is where it gets interesting, showing the internal debates. The video credits Treasury Secretary Bessent and J.P. Morgan's Jamie Dimon with significantly influencing Trump to reverse course on those allied tariffs.
What was their main worry?
The big one, fear of triggering a recession in the U.S. They reportedly pushed back hard on that.
Yeah, the economic impact.
Plus, Jamie Dimon, in the clip they show, argues China and Russia are actively trying to dismantle the post-WWII international order.
So a bigger geopolitical concern, too?
Exactly. He stresses strengthening alliances with Europe, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, not weakening them with tariffs. And he raises another big flag.
What is?
National security.
Yeah.
U.S. dependence on potential adversaries, especially China, for critical things like pharmaceuticals, a major strategic vulnerability.
Right, depending on your rival for essential medicines. Not ideal.
Definitely not. So, real worries about the economy and the bigger strategic picture.
Now, Business Basics also mentioned potential U.S. actions beyond just tariffs, something about delisting Chinese stocks.
Yeah, the potential for financial weapons, essentially. Scott Pent, the lead negotiator, is quoted raising the idea of removing Chinese stocks from U.S. exchanges.
Why? What's the issue?
It boils down to a long-running problem. The CCP blocking independent audits of Chinese companies listed in the U.S.
Ah, the transparency issue.
Exactly. The U.S. side argues this lack of oversight poses huge risks to American investors. You can't verify the books properly.
And they pointed to Evergrande.
Precisely. The Evergrande situation, with all the allegations of fraudulent accounting, is used as a stark warning. A major company potentially cooking the books, and U.S. regulators couldn't fully investigate because of these restrictions.
So letting companies access U.S. capital while playing by different, less transparent rules, that's seen as the core problem.
A major vulnerability they want to address, yeah.
Okay, the Evergrande example really drives that home. Let's shift gears now to the historical context. This didn't just spring up overnight. What do our sources say about China's historical economic approach?
Looking back, Ajanja really emphasizes China's long history with mercantilist ideas. For centuries, the focus was on accumulating wealth internally, hoarding gold and silver, and being pretty resistant to lots of foreign trade.
guarding their secrets.
Very much so, protecting technological advantages fiercely. Silk production is the classic example. The secret only got out through clandestine means.
Right, and the Opium Wars. Both sources mention those.
Yes, they highlight the Opium Wars as a really pivotal and traumatic historical event. Massive trade imbalance, forceful external pressure from Britain.
Pushing opium to fix their trade deficit?
Exactly. It's a stark reminder for China of historical vulnerabilities and the damage from unequal trade relationships. Initially, China kept very tight controls, limiting foreign ships allowed in its ports.
A situation that changed dramatically, often through conflict.
Through conflict and coercion, yes.
A period of exploitation and lasting trauma. But then Asaleh Shada charts this almost unbelievable economic transformation more recently. Can you sketch that out?
The scale is just breathtaking. That source highlights that only 50 years ago, something like 4 out of 5 Chinese citizens worked in agriculture, 96% below the poverty line.
Wow, 96%.
Fast forward to today. China's a global manufacturing powerhouse, makes nearly a third of all manufactured goods worldwide. A major player in trade disputes, even in the space race.
From agrarian poverty to global economic power in decades.
It's almost unprecedented. The video credits Deng Xiaoping's reforms starting in the late 70s as the crucial catalyst. A big shift from Maoist policies, introducing market ideas.
The famous black cat, white cat quote.
It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice.
Exactly.
Pragmatism over strict ideology.
A monumental turning point, clearly. Now let's bring in Ava. It talks about China's expanding global influence, especially through infrastructure investments in Africa. What are the potential upsides and downsides there?
Ava really underscores these massive infrastructure investments across Africa, roads, rail, ports, dams, as a key tool for China's global economic and political influence. Billions in construction.
Providing needed development, presumably?
Yes, absolutely providing needed infrastructure, but there are significant risks, particularly the potential for these huge loans to create debt traps for African nations.
Debt traps.
Yeah. The video points to examples like Sri Lanka, Ecuador. Big Chinese loans for projects lead to crippling debt. In Ecuador's case, they apparently ended up transferring control over a chunk of their oil production to China.
Oof, so control follows the debt.
And the increasing presence of Chinese workers, growing Chinese ownership of assets in Africa, often linked to these debts. It raises concerns about long-term dependence, maybe even neo-colonial dynamics.
So development aid, but with potentially very high strings attached. That source also touches on China's internal challenges, right, as it keeps developing.
It does. Highlights the pressures from this rapid urbanization. About 65% of Chinese now live in cities similar to the USSR in the 80s. Meaning they need new engines for growth beyond just moving people from farms to factories. Sure adds the demographic challenge of shrinking workforce from the one-child policy, falling birth rates.
And rising costs.
Yes, rising labor costs in China are making companies think about moving production elsewhere, maybe impacting China's role as the world's factory.
Plus those ghost cities.
Yeah, Jiro mentions those too. District built but largely empty. It points to internal economic imbalances, the sheer difficulty of managing such massive, rapid development.
Significant internal hurdles to navigate. Okay, finally, let's pull in the perspectives from that U.S. interview on U.S.-China relations more broadly. What were some key insights there?
Shore offered a more nuanced view, emphasizing just how diverse China is internally, suggesting differences between provinces can be as big as within the EU.
Interesting comparison.
The analysis also touched on Xi Jinping's rise, suggesting it was partly driven by worries inside the CCP about losing control due to corruption and inequality that came with that rapid growth.
So consolidation of power as a response.
Possibly. The U.S.-China relationship itself is described as inherently complex. Fierce competitors, but also deeply interconnected economically.
The competitor-partner paradox.
Exactly. And the fundamental difference in political systems. U.S. democracy versus China's one-party rule, even with capitalism, is flagged as a major ongoing source of tension.
And the scale of China's banks.
Yeah, a striking point. The assets of just one of China's big four banks are larger than Russia's entire banking system. Just shows the financial scale we're talking about.
Competitors, interdependent, different systems, massive scale, a truly complex balancing act. Okay, so bringing all this together, what are the crucial takeaways for our listeners after this deep dive?
I think there are a few key things.
Yeah.
First, the U.S. has definitely adopted a very aggressive tariff stance towards China. The stated reasons are curbing military spending and addressing these long-standing grievances about trade practices, IP theft, market access.
Right. Aggression and specific complaints.
Second, this isn't just trade. It's deeply embedded in geopolitics. There's a clear U.S. strategy to try and isolate China economically while shoring up its own alliances.
Geopolitics is central.
Third, there seems to be a growing, maybe not totally unified, but growing global concern about some aspects of China's international behavior trade rules, its relationship with Russia.
Global unease.
And finally, you absolutely have to remember the history and the economics shaping this. Past trade experiences, China's incredible rise, the internal challenges it faces now. It's not just about dollars and cents. It's about different political systems, different worldviews colliding.
Absolutely. A lot to unpack, a lot to think about. And on that note, here's a final thought for you, our listener, to consider.
Okay.
With the U.S. taking such a firm, assertive stance, and knowing that history shows economic ties don't always prevent conflict, what are the real long-term scenarios for global trade and security?
Big question.
Will this aggressive decoupling lead to a fundamental reshaping of the world order? And what role will all these countries caught in the middle play? How will they navigate this new reality? What new, maybe unexpected aha moments might pop up as this whole situation keeps evolving?
Plenty to watch, that's for sure.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.